A very warm welcome. My name is Steffen Pauls and I'm the founder and CEO of Moonfare. Today I host a very special deal talk, and you know the format is well known. We are interviewing here the most well-known and iconic people in private equity in the world. And today it's a very special one. We are here on site in New York in One Vanderbilt, a very famous building, in the office of David Rubenstein.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, David. Look, David, I could spend hours talking about what you have achieved, your career and your background, but let me focus just on a couple of points that I want to highlight. David is the co-founder and current co-chairman of the board at Carlyle. Carlyle is, of course, well known. It's one of the iconic and oldest and largest private equity firms in the world, with almost 30 offices around the world and a history that goes back 37 years in time. David is also very well known, in particular in the US, for hosting two very popular shows on Bloomberg, where he interviews the most prominent CEOs, investors, and politicians. And that's in addition to writing books, doing speeches, and serving as a board member of probably more than a dozen institutions, ranging from the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts to the University of Chicago. So David, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today as my guest. Before the interview, we typically ask our audience, and our audience is comprised of C-level executives, investors, private equity people, and so on. And we ask them, what are you, what is your desire? What should I ask David in this interview? And one question came up, which is related to what I just, did as an introduction. You have so many activities. How do you manage to keep all these balls in the air?
Well, I don't play golf. That saves a lot of time. And I don't drink alcohol. That saves some time as well. I also treat Saturdays and Sundays like they're work days, so I don't really take a lot of time off. And but everything I'm doing, I enjoy, so I don't regard it as work. When you enjoy something, if you enjoy golf or you enjoy tennis or whatever it might be, it's not that difficult to do. And so you make time for things you enjoy, like you do in life. And so it's not that difficult. I do have a lot of people that help me manage the time constraints that I have, but I'm enjoying everything I'm doing. My biggest problem is I'm aging, as we all are. And at a certain point, you realize you probably can't do what you could do 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So I'm trying to get everything in before my time comes, and I call it, sprinting to the finish line.
One of the things, one of your many activities is that you published recently a book, it was a couple of years ago, on leadership, and you wrote about the principles of extraordinary people, ranging from Bill Gates to Oprah Winfrey. What makes these people, in your experience, so special, so persuasive, that millions of people listen to them and follow them?
Well, persistence is everything. You have to persist. Nobody has an idea that's so wonderful. Everybody says that's great right from the start. You have to persist. Typically, you have to fail. You have to pick yourself up and get back into the game. You also have to have some communication skills. All of life is about persuading people to do what you want. You persuade people by talking well, writing well, or by leading by example. And these people that I've interviewed tend to be people that know how to persuade people. They lead by example. They interview well. They know how to get things done, and they persist.
Look, we all can learn from history, and I've listened recently to your conversation with Walter Isaacson, who wrote, as many people know, a series of biographies on geniuses ranging from Leonardo da Vinci to Albert Einstein. I think the most recent one is on Elon Musk. I know you're very interested in history yourself. Is there a historical figure, a particular one, that you especially admire?
Well, I certainly admire, as an American, Abraham Lincoln. He held the country together. I think without Lincoln, the country would have been split in two, almost certainly. I admire Winston Churchill because I think without his leadership during World War II, I don't think that the result would have been what it turned out to be. In more recent times, there are two women I certainly admire. One of them is Margaret Thatcher. I thought she did a very good job in revitalizing the British economy at the time and doing other things in Britain that I think were very helpful. And also Angela Merkel from your country. Angela Merkel, thinking about this, she came from Eastern Germany, to rise up from Eastern Germany and to lead all of Germany and to do it for almost 15 years is an incredible task. And I greatly admire the things she did to kind of help bring Europe together in many ways.
It's a very interesting one because in my country, in Germany, people are quite divided about her. Yeah, in many respects, she's seen as, in particular, from what she did for Europe as a whole, as a great figure. But in when it comes to climate change, she stopped the nuclear power, as a source of energy for Germany, which is part of the reason for the rise in energy prices and so on. So people in Germany are quite divided, but I'm glad to hear that the outside perspective is much
Well,
more
the people in every country are always divided by their leaders. So Winston Churchill wasn't uniformly popular. Abraham Lincoln was not uniformly popular. You have to regain this popularity perhaps when you're gone. So 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, I think Merkel will be looked at as a much greater leader than maybe people look at her now in Germany. But some of the things she did was quite remarkable. And you think about it today, when Merkel was the leader of Germany, she was really the leader of Europe. Today, tell me who the leader of Europe is. We don't really have somebody anywhere comparable to her. So yes, she may have done some things that some people in Germany don't like her, people around the world. But when you think about her as a historical figure, 50 years from today, she'll be looked back as a very significant figure in German and European history.
Definitely. Look, David, let's talk a little bit about private equity. And the way I call the current environment is the world is in disorder. We have war in Europe. We have this terrible conflict. I would call it a war in the Middle East. We have this, emerging, more and more emerging conflict and source of, a war in Taiwan. We have broken value chains across the globe. We have the climate change with all aspects that come along. We have seen many difficulties in getting financing done, deals done, a mismatch between buyers and sellers in the private equity industry. What has Carlyle been doing to cope with this environment? Anything that you changed from the way you approached things in the past?
Well, remember, in any given time in the world, throughout the world's history, there's always problems. There's never a time where everything is wonderful, peace and prosperity break out all over the world, and nobody has anything to worry about. So we always have problems. So today we have particular problems today, but they'll pass in time and we'll go on to other problems. In Carlyle's case, it's a large global firm, well known around the world now. We've been around, as you pointed out, almost 40 years, and we've had a very good track record over this long period of time, investing through good and bad times. Today, it's a time where it's harder to get loans than it used to be because interest rates are high, but they're coming down. It's also harder to get sellers and buyers to come up with an agreement on price because buyers are afraid they might be buying into a recession and sellers are afraid they're not going to get the return that they told their investors they're going to get. So there's been a mismatch of 10 or 20% in terms of valuations. But I think that will come together a bit this year as interest rates come down and as I think we're not going to go into recession. I think there was a fear of recession in the United States for quite a bit last year. I think right now we're past that fear. Now recessions can always happen, but right now I don't think there's a feeling in the United States we're likely to go into recession. So I think the deals world will get much better. I think you'll see more deal activity, selling and buying by Carlyle and other firms.
What is your reason in this context, or your reasoning or your explanation for the mismatch in public markets, which are at an all-time high, at least the German DAX as an example, and the feeling and sentiment in the private equity industry? Why is this mismatch out there?
Well, there's a reason why private equity and public equities are different because they're different people that go into these kind of things. And the public markets are really a sentiment about people are thinking any given day, every given hour. Private equity has a longer perspective. And so a longer perspective tends to have people look at things somewhat differently. But the public markets are really an indicator of what people are thinking that day or that hour about the outlook of the world, the economy, the war and peace, and so forth. Private markets are a little bit different, so they should always be a bit of a mismatch. And if they were always the same, there would be no reason to go into private equity because if they were just reflect exactly what public equity does, why not just go into public equity? It's easier to get in, easier to get out. So private markets are always going to be somewhat different.
And with respect to what has to happen on the private side of things, that markets can rebound. You mentioned the interest rates coming down. You mentioned that hopefully a recession can be avoided, the soft landing. Anything else that needs to happen this year so that we really have a profound basis for a rebound?
Well, in the United States, I think our biggest worry, or my biggest worry, is the dysfunction of the U.S. government. We haven't been able to get our Congress to kind of work together in a bipartisan way. And obviously, working with an executive, a chief executive, is more complicated when you don't have a bipartisan approach in Congress. So that is something that's difficult for us to kind of convey to people around the world who don't live here. You know, Woodrow Wilson famously said, "I wanted to make the world safe for democracy," and we entered World War I. And the United States foreign policy for years has been to make the world safe for democracy. But I think we need to make the United States safe for democracy, and we need to get our democracy to work somewhat better. That's number one concern in the United States. Number two is whether the economy can really hold up. We don't appear to be going into a recession, but recessions come out of the blue sometimes. We have recessions every 7 years on average in the United States. We really haven't had a serious recession for 7 years or so. So as a result, I think we are due for something to be a low down or a slowdown in the economy. I don't know that it's going to happen anytime soon, but at some point in the next 2 or 3 years, we'll obviously have a slowdown, and that's something we have to always guard against.
Look, we talked earlier about that people in their countries are probably all divided about their political leadership. And talking and meeting many people here in New York this week, many people stated that it's very, very likely that we have a new old President Donald Trump end of this year. Would that be, helpful in bringing the democracy back and maybe even, mitigating negative impact on the economy that you mentioned? Or what is your view on this likely scenario?
I worked in the White House for President Carter, and so I've been hanging around Washington and presidents for many, many years. I have a book coming out later this year on the presidency. And my general view is trying to predict who the President of the United States is going to be about 1 year in advance is a fool's errand. So we're now roughly 10 months away, 11 months away from a presidential election. If you were to predict who the president's going to be each of the last 10 presidential elections a year in advance, you'd be wrong almost every time. The conventional wisdom is always wrong. So it's hard to know. The conventional wisdom today is you'll have two people who are older than me running for President of the United States. So while the population's going down in terms of its age, in some respects we have a lot of young people, we have two older people who are likely to be the candidates, but things could change and we just don't know.
Look, going back to 2008, David, and you are not only a visionary leader, you also made a visionary statement about the future back then, because you said once, the recession has ended or will end, private equity would enter into its platinum age. And, the time would be better than it has been ever before. And this is exactly what has happened. So you talked a little bit about the near-term future. What is your view on private equity in light of these incredible 10 years that are behind us for the next 10 years?
Private equity has done well because of the incentives given to managers and incentives given to the professional investors. And so it's really been a way to get better rates of return for average investors. And that's worked through good and bad times. So I think that will continue to be the case. Now, the rates of return may come down compared to where they were 20 years ago because there was less competition. But as more and more people come into private equity and rates come down, rates of return come down, it's still going to be higher than public equity returns. So over the last 30 years or so, on every given year, any given year for the last 30 years, private equity returns in any particular year outperform public equity returns. And so as a general rule of thumb, if you go with good private equity people, you're likely to outperform public equity returns. I think that will continue as well. And particularly, we're going to have more democratization of private equity and more private equity in outside Europe and the United States. Europe and the United States account for roughly 65% of all private equity. But now you've got the emerging markets that are truly emerging. So Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, Asia. You're going to see more private equity over the next 10 years go into those countries, and therefore more opportunities for people to make private equity returns.
Look, you mentioned the outperformance and you mentioned the democratization. Let me jump on both topics for a minute. In terms of outperformance, totally true. But it depends all on manager selection. If you just, there is no index, as I say. You can't buy an index and play private equity. It's a recipe for disaster because you wouldn't get more than what you would get in public markets, if at all. You have to play with the best firms like Carlyle. What is your explanation, when you also take the fundraising environment, that the large firms, the Blackstones, Carlyles, KKRs, absorb most of the fundraising and other emerging alpha-generating managers are being left out? Why is that?
Well, I wouldn't say they're left out because there are lots of organizations now, large sovereign wealth funds or public pension funds, that want to go after emerging managers. And therefore, it's actually much easier than it was 10, 20, or 30 years ago to get emerging managers funded. There's no doubt that just like anything in the world, the biggest companies get the most capitalization. Public companies, the biggest public companies, Apple or so forth, they get the biggest attention, the biggest shareholders. And the same is true in private equity. But there is a real interest now in going to the smaller firms. And that is because a lot of people realize that the smaller firms can probably get higher rates of return because they're deploying fewer dollars. So if you go with a good emerging manager, somebody that's worked in a large firm like Carlyle or Blackstone or KKR, and they start their own firm and it's relatively small, you can probably get a lot of co-investment there, which you wouldn't otherwise get. You can probably get your capital deployed more readily because the fund isn't that big. So there's a lot of interest in emerging managers, and I think that's going to continue.
You know, David, why I founded Moonfare? I wanted, when I was, as I told you, with KKR for more than a decade and had the privilege to invest into the funds and alongside the firm into certain companies. And when I left KKR, I was suddenly, left out. There was no chance. A minimum investment was 10 million, not my pocket size, not today, not at that point in time. And that was basically the origin of the idea to set up and to found Moonfare. Why? It came out of a feeling of unfairness. Yeah, the large families, institutional investors able to play this fantastic asset class, private individuals like me being left out. And the truth is 98% of the population is left out to play private equity and is not benefiting from this unprecedented value creation that's happening in private markets. We talked, or we briefly touched on democratization. What is your view on this, we call it mega theme, that Moonfare, among others, is spearheading?
Of course, public pension funds in the United States or around the world, they are representing money that is owned really by teachers or firemen or policemen or so forth. So they do get some benefit from private equity because those big funds are going into private equity funds. But for an individual like you or an individual like me, if I want to go into a private equity firm, if I was not at Carlyle, it'd be difficult sometimes to do this, particularly if you don't have a high net worth. So we think that there should be more of a democratization. And let me explain the situation. If you are an idiot, but your father gave you $100 million, you're qualified to be an investor in private equity. Yeah. If you are brilliant, you're first in your class at Harvard or Yale or Princeton or someplace like that, but you go to Teach for America or a nonprofit, you don't have a big income. You need to have a bigger income, but you can't earn it by going to private equity because you're not, quote, qualified. It's kind of ass backwards in many ways. And I think the regulators in the United States are beginning to recognize this. So increasingly, I think you're going to see a situation where you have your 401ks, your IRAs, or equivalent kind of things in Europe or other places around the world, retirement accounts, will be able to put a certain amount of money into illiquid private equity because it won't be so large and it's not likely to do poorly overall. So I think that will happen, but it takes time. Democratization is not easy to achieve, but it will take time. I'd say over the next 10 years, you'll see a more and more democratization of private equity all over the world. So almost everybody will have some ability to say they're an investor in private equity if they want to be.
Look, definitely same view. It takes time, it needs education, it needs the right products, and the industry is working on it. Look, let me go back and lean on your incredible experience over 37 years now with Carlyle, where you have seen crises and recessions all the time through. Are there any evergreen investing principles that you stick to no matter what?
Well, the most important investment principles are: one, diversify. Number two, don't believe the rates of return are going to be as high as somebody might tell you. Have realistic expectations. If you're trying to get 50% internal rates of return, you're more likely to get 0% rates of return. So also, rely on good money managers. The average person cannot really do deals himself or herself. It's not realistic. So you've got to rely on money managers who give you reasonable fees. They're very transparent about what they're doing, and they have a track record. They have a reputation for integrity, and they have a reputation for getting good people to stay there and work there. So do a lot of examination of the people you're investing with, but give good people money to manage. Don't put it all in one area, one basket or so forth, and also have realistic expectations of rates of return.
Look, some people say a year ago or so, and actually it was, I think, December 6th or so, when OpenAI and ChatGPT came into everybody's words, that was the creation of a minute of hype. Right. And of course, I guess there's no doubt that AI will change the world, but except of taking AI to the side, what are the industries you say investors should focus most on in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, of course, the traditional industries are ones that are still going to be very popular. So, that say things like manufacturing or consumer retail, they're not going away. Clearly, in recent years, we've seen a big interest in sports-related investing, big interest in biotech investing. I think biotech will be a big boom area over the next 10 years or so. One area I'll mention is something that is not unrelated to AI, but it's called quantum computing. Quantum computing will revolutionize computing. I hope I live long enough to see it because it's complicated to get it done. But that's a very important area. I think data science related to AI is also a very important area. I think all things related to CRISPR, which is the ability to kind of change genes in humans and so forth, that will be a big growth area. And I think things related to climate tech will also be very important over the next 10, 20, 30 years or so.
And talking about AI for 1 minute, what is your view? Will like the large tech players, the Apples, the Googles, also those that are close to the governments, will those be the big winners, or do you think we will see a new AI Google, a new AI Apple, and a new AI Meta coming the way, or will they be absorbed by the big ones who are also close to
Right.
Washington?
The conventional wisdom today is that the best way, the safest way to play AI is to go into Google's, the Apple's, the Microsoft. And that may be the safest way, but the highest rate of return probably will come from some startup in Silicon Valley or in Europe somewhere that we don't know about. So I think it's not easy to say it's going to be one or another. Who would have predicted 20 years ago that Apple would be the most valuable market company in the world? Or who would have predicted AI would come on as rapidly as it has? So you just don't know. I would say don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Look, you mentioned some of the largest tech companies in the world. And talking about investing, you have done as Carlyle, you personally, an incredible, an incredible track record in terms when it comes to investing. But let's talk of some of the misses. Any misses where you say we really missed, we got something fundamentally wrong, we didn't invest into this company which became an A player, and what is your thinking around luck when it comes to investing?
Well, luck is very important in life generally. Where'd you meet your spouse, your partner? Where'd you go to school? All these kind of things are a matter of luck. You might have had an introduction, or you might have met somebody by chance. Everything is luck in some respects, but you can make your own luck by trying to find good contacts or good relationships and so forth. There's no doubt that I've made a lot of mistakes in the investment world, and anybody that's an investor has made a lot of mistakes, because if you don't try to do many different things, you're not going to be really finding the good deals. So I've missed, for example, Facebook when Mark Zuckerberg was in college. I thought it was going nowhere. I turned it down. Jeff Bezos, at the very beginning, we had some stock. We sold it right away. We thought that was going nowhere. We turned down Mark Andreessen's initial company. We thought that was going nowhere. I make mistakes every day. I talk about them maybe more than I should, but I make mistakes all the time, because I want to show people that even if you are a reasonably good investor, you're likely to make mistakes, but don't be afraid to make mistakes, because that's what life is about, is learning from your mistakes.
Couldn't agree more. It's something that I tell my children every day, by the way, learn from your mistakes. Look, one thing that I really, David, and I don't want to flatter you, but I find it impressive, is what you do with your money for different causes, especially in the area of art and science. And one thing that I found particular, draw out my attention, was that you're purchasing a lot of historical documents, but you purchased a copy of the Magna Carta and you gave it back to a public institution. Why do you think that preserving history is so important?
Well, life is really a Darwinian kind of thing. You're theoretically making progress as we go forward and learn from mistakes. But when you learn about history, you learn about the mistakes that were made in the past and the good things in the past. But if you don't learn about history, you're not going to know the things you should avoid doing, the things you should do better at. So when you learn historic documents, you learn what's in the Magna Carta, you'd say, why did they do that? And what does it really mean for us? And what the importance of preserving these documents is this. We know what's in the Magna Carta. We know what's in the Declaration of Independence. We know what's in the Constitution. Why do we need these old copies? Because it turns out that humans still don't have a brain that treats original documents the same as seeing something on a computer slide. If you see the original of the Magna Carta, you're more likely to be prepared when you go to see it and learn about it, and more likely to have a curator tell you about it when you're there, and you're more likely to read about it later. way. The same is true on buildings. I like to preserve old buildings, the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, Lincoln Memorial. Why? Because when people go there, they're going to get a sense of history. And all of life is about learning about the mistakes of the past and the good things in the past. And if we don't preserve history and we don't study history, we're going to make a lot of mistakes that we shouldn't make.
Look, I said it in the beginning, we always ask our audience in advance before these deal talks to hand in their questions. And I want to go into a few of them. But before I go into the Q&A from our audience, let me ask the following. You were born in a blue-collar Jewish family in Baltimore. And you said it that you weren't particularly successful as a lawyer. And your political career, you mentioned in the Carter administration, was pretty short-lived. But you went on and founded one of the largest and most successful private equity firms in the world. Given your journey, what's one of the biggest life lessons that you have learned? And the question that I always ask in these deal talks, what advice would you give your younger self?
Well, I wish I had done many things differently when I was younger, maybe stay in shape better, maybe learn more skills than I have, maybe learn how to play a musical instrument. Wish I could speak a foreign language, which I really can't do. But the most important thing is don't take no for an answer. Be persistent. Try to be polite to people. Treat people the way you want them to treat you. And most importantly, retain some humility. I think the greatest leaders in the world are humble because they've made mistakes and they've learned from it. Now, Abraham Lincoln didn't go around saying, you know, I won the Civil War, I should get people to tell me how great I am. Great leaders are humble. Now, there are leaders that are not so humble. They may not be the role models that I have in mind, but I think humility, no matter what you accomplish, you realize you're just one person out of 8 billion on the face of the earth. Nobody's that important. And so you've got to retain certain humility, and that's what is important to me, is retaining humility, because whatever I might have accomplished, I got lucky in many ways. And in the end, when I'm gone, people aren't going to remember me anyway. So you have to put this in context. Nobody is going to change the world dramatically by him or herself.
So true. David, thanks so much for this. Look, let's move to a couple of questions from the audience, from the community. And one I like very much because there's a quote from another very famous private equity pioneer and deal maker who said, I know my investors or investment team for 10 years now. I have observed them over the past 10 years, but I still don't know who of them is really a great investor. So the past 10 years were, I call them honeymoon times. Everybody, more or less, every fool could make a deal and make some money. Which skills now, looking forward in more turbulent water, I would call it, which skills and capabilities are required for private equity firms to stand out and to survive?
I think today the large firms, KKR, Blackstone, Apollo, Carlyle, TPG, these firms are hard to replicate today because they're so large and it's going to take a while for somebody to build up something to that size. I think today specialization is very important. Early on we specialized, but then we grew past the specialization. We have specializations now, but we're not known now for one thing. The same with KKR or Blackstone. I think if you really want to make a mark for yourself in private equity today, take a small area, make it your own, be the expert in it. So, for example, I have a daughter that invests in healthy food. So I don't think she knows many of the things that about what Carlyle does, but she knows healthy food because that's her area of expertise. And so I don't know much about healthy food, but if I care about knowing more, I ask her. And that's true of investors. If they want a specialization, I'd say I want an environmental expert, a fintech expert. So try to specialize. And the most important thing is treat your investors well through good and bad times. Don't be arrogant with them when you're really doing well. Be humble if you do really well. And also make sure you give them information all the time, but also give good incentives to the people working for you. You want people to work for you because they really enjoy working for you and they think they're doing something useful. And I think this is a very important point. I'd like to tell people that when private equity people are doing something useful, they're doing something and they're doing something well, they're doing something useful for society. For example, there's a private equity firm in Massachusetts that for 10 years backed a small biotech company that didn't produce one product in 10 years. They stayed with it. And later that company became Moderna, which produced the vaccine that many of us benefited from. So what those people did in that particular biotech firm was to stay with it, and they did something useful for society. So when you're a really good private equity investor and you're doing something useful for society, I think it's a helpful thing for humanity. Also, I think if you look at the U.S. economy, it's been really pulling away from the rest of the world now. It's pulling away from China and pulling away from Europe. Our economy used to be smaller, the GDP of the United States than Europe. Europe has more people. Now our GDP is bigger. Why is that? I think because the private equity ethos in the United States has become so important in our business community that we've used these principles and we made ourselves more productive and we're more efficient than we used to be. So I think private equity investors should feel they're contributing something to society. They're not just making money to just buy yachts or things. They're doing something useful, as the Moderna example I think illustrates.
Look, it's a striking point you're making. It's indeed the GDP, the whole Europe, pre-financial crisis was larger than the US. Now it's 1.5 times difference.
Right.
Post-financial crisis. I would add to what you have said is also the ability of Europe to cope with crisis and take the chances out of it. America at the end made money with all these bailouts and backings. Europe is a very, very different.
Europe is a more complicated place in many ways. Obviously, Brexit has changed the face of Europe in some respects, and many different cultures and language and so forth. But think about this. Europe has brilliant people, great universities, great technologies. But right now, today, as we sit here and talking in 2024, what technology developed in Europe is essential for your day-to-day life? The technology that people are dependent on are Google, Microsoft, Netflix, Apple, Amazon. These are generally American technologies. Where is the European technology? Now, I don't want to denigrate Europe. I hope Europe comes up with a great technology that we're all dependent on. But why did Europe not develop one of those technologies? There are lots of answers to that. We can't do them all here and go through all the answers. But I think Europe has fallen behind as an entrepreneurial kind of society. And I think Americans have done some things that Europeans didn't do. Now, if you want to spend a great time in the summer, there's no place better than being in the Mediterranean or Europe, right? Europe is a great place to visit, but a technology that changes the world hasn't yet come from Europe in the last 20 or 30 years. I hope that will happen in the future, though.
I guess it's a bit doubtful because just one example, David sharing, when I talk, and I'm very much interested in AI and talk to many, and we have great talent in AI in Europe as well. It's not only the US and China, but if you talk to these guys, they say, no, I'm gonna move to either a small place in Switzerland or I'm gonna move to the US. Why? Because my nurture is data, and because of data regulation, I'm not getting what I need in order to run my algorithms. So people are leaving the country, and we have a great regulation framework now. EU is very proud to be the first one who came up with something. Let's see how it plays out. But the talent is leaving the ship. So probably the next big theme will be again a war or a fight between the US and China and not Europe.
Well, I don't know about that, but I would say, for example, France developed the first internet-type company. They had an internet before we ever heard of the internet here, but that didn't come to fruition in many ways, didn't conquer the world. Also, in the United States, parents often say, I hope you will grow up to be a successful business person. Not all the parents, but the idea of making a lot of money is not considered a sin in the United States, whereas in certain parts of Europe, you're not incented by your parents to grow up and make a lot of money. And therefore, you kind of do other things, and maybe people don't work quite as hard in certain areas. America's not perfect. We have lots of problems, and I can go through them all day. But I do think we've been able to develop an entrepreneurial society. And think about it. The word entrepreneur is not an American word. It's a French word. But ironically, we're more entrepreneurial in the United States than the French are or other people in Europe. It's kind of a strange thing when you think about it.
Look, I'm a big believer, David, and you are, of course, one of the examples for this, that people who become extremely successful are seeing things that others don't. And when it comes to hiring now and getting the best talent, you probably have to get talent on board in Carlyle, which is different to what you would have needed 20 years ago. Are there any particular skills or capabilities when it comes to young people you are looking at that are different from what was relevant when I joined KKR 20 years ago?
Well, I think the basic skills are mostly the same. Learn how to communicate with people by either writing reasonably well or talking reasonably well. Learning how to work past 9 to 5. You've got to put in the time and the effort. Learning how to benefit from your mistakes. It's very important to do that. Learning how to connect with people, learning how to share the credit and take the blame. Many people don't like to take the blame. You should take the blame if something bad happened, and if it's something good's happened, share the credit with other people. These are kind of principles that I like, and I want somebody, when I hire somebody who I think wants to do something with their life more than just make money. They want to do something where they're trying to make the world a better place, somewhat in the background of their mind, so that they won't just make money and just put it in the bank account for themselves. I want people that actually have a vision of being a useful human being and doing something useful for humanity.
And when it comes to education, what would you recommend them? What would you advise them? There are some, extremes telling us or telling me, don't send your children to university. It's useless. It's a commodity. Knowledge is a commodity. Sam Altman, by the way, said in an interview very recently that even creativity is not what differentiates people. What would it be?
Well, there's always going to be a Bill Gates and there's always going to be a Mark Zuckerberg who dropped out of Harvard, both cases, and they did reasonably well. If you think you're Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates and you're going to take a chance, fine. But in general, for 99.9% of the people, getting a good education, a college education, if not a graduate education as well, is a better chance to succeed, in my view. And remember, when you get an education, to go to college, the purpose of getting an education is not to make money. The purpose is to make you a better person, have your brain think more, be more creative, be a person that you're really going to be proud of, to say, this is my child. He or she can read well, talk well, and is educated about society. And so I think it's a mistake if we often say to people, well, you should go be a plumber or you should be an electrician. You're not really qualified to go to college or you're not going to benefit from it. You get a lot of other benefits out of college, not just making money, you're learning how to make money. So I think people should get as much education as they realistically can. And everybody will be an exception. In some cases, there'll be a Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates. But as a general rule, unless you really are that talented or you're Albert Einstein or you're really just gifted, and Albert Einstein did have a PhD, but as a general rule of thumb, I think education is the way out of poverty, the way out of blue-collar backgrounds like I had. If I didn't have the education I had, I would probably not be anywhere close to where I am today.
Makes total sense. David, let's assume it's December 2024 and you look back. What would you say for you personally, for Carlyle, for the globe, for the world, what would be a successful year? What would be where you say, wow, this was terrific?
Well, of course, I always think the world's falling apart and the bad things are going to happen to me. So if I got through the year without any health problems and the economy did pretty well, I'd be happy. But as a general rule of thumb, I think what we need to do in the world this year, in 2024, is try to resolve the situation in Gaza and Israel, resolve the situation between Ukraine and Russia, and hopefully nothing between China and Taiwan occurs. If we can have no major war like that going on, that would be a great step forward. If we can make some progress in climate change, that would be a step forward. If we can actually figure out how to make AI work so that people's lives are better, not threatened by it, I think that would be a good thing. And I think in my own case, the case of the United States, get our government to work in a functional way so that we're not just in a perils of Pauline all the time, whether we can fund the government or not. And then actually find ways that make more people come out of poverty and more people feel like they're on the earth for a purpose and they're doing something useful and they're enjoying their lives. Many people don't enjoy their lives. We have a very high suicide rate in the United States, and other countries have a higher growing suicide rate. We also have problems of health challenges we have in the United States, drug problems, obesity, other things. I hope we can work on these kind of things. So 2024 is a year where we're going to have an important presidential election in the United States. Hopefully it will lead to something good happening in the future. But we've got some challenges we got to address for sure.
David, let's hope that some of these dreams, if not all, become true. That would be already a terrific achievement. For today, it was fantastic having you with us. Thank you so much for your time. Terrific insights. I really enjoyed the deal talk.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and congratulations on the success of your own company.
Thanks so much, David. And to the audience, thanks so much for dialing in and for all the questions. Hope to see you, of course, at our next Deal Talk session, which is soon to come. And stay healthy until we are all together again. Thank you so much.